Here we go. So let's go into the next thing. I don't know about what's wrong with video, but I'll try to figure it out. The YouTubes have made some changes. All right, so a couple of investigations got real fast. First off, the military, let's come back, even though the United States always had a very small military. The U.S. would not become a military state until 1947. And now the U.S. spends as much, or spends 40% of all military spending in the world now. So that's quite a shock. But also the second bank of the United States, Madison, the president who allowed the first bank to go under would sign the second bank. It was very much like the first one, only 20 years though. It'd have to be renewed in 20 years, and this would become a big issue in the Jackson administration. Nicholas Biddle would become the president of the bank, and his fights with Jackson would portray many of the problems in the United States with the Industrial Revolution. He was a young man, so how do they draw him? You really see it, can't you, on that one? And so one more thing. There's a real talk about connecting this vast country together. And a road bill called, weird name, the bonus bill. And it's in a road called internal improvements. We'll go just through the state of Kentucky. I should add, internal improvements. Have you heard of infrastructure? Which is a relatively new term. That's another name for it. In the 19th century, roads, canals, bridges, railroads, internal improvements. That's what they call it. Means the same thing as infrastructure. But it's only in Kentucky. And the Constitution was unclear, at least to them at that time. Can the federal government build a road in a state? Sure, they can build a road in federal territory, but in a state, especially only in one state, so it doesn't cross state lines. And Madison, the president, also the father of the Constitution, vetoed that. And this issue about internal improvements will stick with the United States for years.
He vetoed the road?
Yeah, vetoed the bonus bill. The bonus bill would create the road. Why they call it the bonus bill? It was just an additional spending, a bonus spending. It's kind of weird. But it was just through Kentucky.
Okay.
An internal improvement, I'll just put that down there, that meant roads. So there's a road in Kentucky. Like the national road, it was basically going to connect down to the Mississippi and down to the Natchez Trace. So for the next 50 years, this will be a crisis. And Southerners, more and more fearful of the federal government infringing on slavery, will do whatever they can to stop roads or railroads. Then the Civil War would hit. That's when you get the Transcontinental Railroad bill. The federal government would decide then, to this day, to build roads. But even then, it's kind of shaky. When you look at all the road construction, most of that in Montana, about 95% is funded by the federal government through taxes, much of it 50 cent a gallon tax, 50 cent a gallon gasoline tax. So next, the era of good feelings. This went from 1816 to 1824 to 1824, 2 presidential terms, where there's basically only one party. In 1816, the Federalists, their last gasp, would win a few states, and then that'd be it. Monroe would win the next election in 1820, all but one, 1824. So 2 presidential terms, or 8 years. He won all but one vote, and that was just done to make sure Washington was the only unanimous president. And so this gave people the feeling that there's no political disagreements. Washington's farewell address has been met. Everyone agrees. No, of course not. The Federalists just rolled into the Republicans, and there'll be a big fight that will blow up. Well, heck, there'd almost be civil war in 1820, which we'll get to in a little bit. And 1824 in the Krupp bargain and the creation of a brand new party called the Democracy, the Democratic Party. There's Monroe, and every time I look at this, every picture of him, to me at least, doesn't he kind of look like Washington? Kind of. They both were born in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Maybe everybody in Fredericksburg, Virginia looks like that. He's so convenient. Yes?
So it was 1816 to...
1824. And then 1824, that election in the video, the Krupp bargain, that's when it showed it's all going to blow up.
Wait, are you talking about the era of good feelings?
Mm-hmm.
What year was that again? Sorry.
To 24. 1816 to 1824. Where there's only one party, we're all get together. No, it just hit crisis. couple things we got to get then. That Convention of 1818 would establish, the big thing we need to know is this border right here. That was on your map. But it showed that Britain and the United States, and to a lesser degree Spain, but Britain and the United States could come together. And they actually had many more interests economically, trade interests, Britain and the United States, and they shouldn't go to war. They had a vested interest also to keep other countries out. This wouldn't be resolved for another 30 years.
Wait, Spain owns Canada at the time?
No, Britain does.
Oh, Britain. Okay.
Yeah. So that border would be established between Britain and the United States, the 49th parallel. And eventually, 30 years later, they just extended to the sea. One more big treaty. Jackson invaded Florida, but the United States was already looking to acquire Florida. It's called the Adams-Onis Treaty, and the U.S. got Florida. The U.S. got Florida. It also established this border right here, kind of clarified the border between Louisiana and New Spain. But who was leaving the U.S. and going into Florida that prompted Jackson's invasion? Say it again? Slaves. Yeah, slaves were running away, and that provided them safe haven in Florida. It's not that, Spain still had slavery, but very few Spanish colonists lived there, and slaves could run away and join the various tribes, including the relatively new tribe called the Seminoles. You've all probably heard of the Seminoles. They were created by remnants of tribes who were devastated by disease and lots of runaway slaves. And that's why Jackson invaded, to keep slaves from running away. The whole thing about slavery is they don't want a safety valve for slaves to run away. So once again, this gets into the many complexities of Jackson and so many of the founding fathers. Now, Washington, D.C. was kind of upset that Jackson did this without orders, but at the same time, they're kind of like, let's see what he can get away with. If he goes into Florida, Spain will have no choice but to sell it for cheap because Spain can't hold it anymore. Spain is devastated after the Napoleonic Wars. So we're getting close to now, at least Louisiana and eastward, the borders of the United States. There'll be a near war in Maine. That's coming up a little bit later. So Adams-Onis, U.S. got Florida. And then the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine in 1823, this actually happened a couple years after a series of revolutions concluded in all New Spain. New Spain goes from what is now the border, California, Oregon border, all the way down to Argentina. Those were almost all colonies of Spain. What country controlled Brazil? Yeah, Portugal. And France had a little bit of South America. Britain had a little bit of Central America. That would become British Honduras and then Belize. So Belize was a British colony. But all the rest, from here down, had revolutions, and in 2 years they kicked the Spanish out and created a series of new countries from Argentina, we go, Chile, Bolivia, Ecuador. I mean, you just keep going up. All of the isthmus of Latin America, from Panama up to Guatemala, tried to create one big country. They couldn't get along, so they broke up into smaller countries. And then a massive, Mexico, massive. The U.S. didn't want, and Britain too, they didn't want France or Spain to come back, or some other European country to try to scoop up these weak new independent nations. Britain and France, or Britain and the U.S. couldn't come to an agreement, so Monroe just issued a foreign policy statement. We called it a doctrine, and this is what it did: no European intervention in the Western Hemisphere. Britain didn't agree to this, but I'll get back to why I put Britain in an exclamation point in just a second. No European intervention. So they're saying we don't want the French to come in, or the Austrians, or the Prussians, or other would-be powers. Aggressive, relatively weak European powers who want an empire. So with that, the U.S. couldn't enforce that. Ironically, it was the Royal Navy, Britain's fleet, deterred other countries from coming in. And so, except for places that are already colonies, most of them stayed relatively independent. France did try to take Mexico.
Why did they do that?
Just to expand the French Empire. That was in the 1860s. Have you ever heard of the holiday that's not celebrated that much in Mexico called Cinco de Mayo? But it's celebrated north of the Mexican border, which I think is really funny. Mexicans think it's really funny. That came from when the French tried to take Mexico. Yeah.
So you're saying that the Britain didn't like this, but they still kept out other countries?
No, Britain actually didn't want other countries coming in. They saw in their vested interest to keep independent republics.
Mhm.
So the U.S. and Britain couldn't come up with an agreement, so the U.S. just issued it, but Britain ended up enforcing it.
Okay.
But this cartoon is actually from the beginning of the 20th century. So when the U.S. was becoming a great power going into the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt literally would find this old doctrine that most people had forgot about it, dusted it off, and said the Western Hemisphere will be controlled by the U.S. Hold it off. And so that's implied that the U.S. is kind of protecting it. But let's be clear about what it meant. The U.S. is going to dominate it. That's coming in the 20th century, we call big stick diplomacy. So these are a few of the political things that happened between that. But while this is going on, the entire world is changing. The entire world is changing. And so, actually, I forgot to give you the heading for these notes, didn't I? So put a new heading for this thing. Nationalism kind of covers that just for that.
Okay, that's what it said.
And that's for, I believe, chapter 2.
Wait, how did you see what chapter it says?
This is kind of chapters 8, 9, and 10.
Oh.
I'm combining them all.
Okay, Lena,
Everybody write down American system. This is called the American system of politics, industry, and many of the ideas would be created. Yeah. Football, yeah. So like one of the big reforms would be like new prisons. It's actually really cool. In Philadelphia, who needs a bookmark? In Philadelphia. The first ever penitentiary was made in Philadelphia. You know what a penitentiary is? That's where prisoners can go and get penance. And that's where the term penitentiary comes from. They were hellholes. These little rooms where they had to stay in isolation and never talk to each other. About 2 or 3 years. The idea is they can ponder why they're bad and become better. It was really cool and creepy at the same time. We thought about doing the ghost tour in there. But while underlying all this kind of events are happening, the world would begin convulsions that would change everything. And of course, I mean the Industrial Revolution. And look at it! Look at that! And what is his job? To sit there and glare.
I didn't even know there was a guy there.
You know what happened? They said, hey, go sit there so we get the size of the wheel. And he's like, yeah. They started a massive wheel-making progress that would, soon the entire continent would be covered with iron wheels. Carried by snapping turtle. Okay, so with that, the Industrial Revolution would change it. It's hard to find something that had more impact than the Industrial Revolution to human history. And I'm including the biggies like fire and the plow. It's that big. If they would have thrown us, any one of us, well, you guys, I'm from a different, tougher generation, but you guys, and thrown you into 1800 and put you in a city, so it's a little bit more what you're used to, but thrown into a city, you would have no idea. The whole world would be just this massive, confusing place. How they made a living wouldn't have made sense. Their values towards the future wouldn't have made sense. Just the speed and the nature of people did things wouldn't have made sense. No one cared about what time it is, things like that. None of it would have made sense. Most of us would have probably curled up in the fetal position and cried. But in 1840, they threw us in the world, as being a city, it would start to make sense. We could at least rationalize it. And by 1860, it's pretty close. You know, they have the same basic ideas. The world went through a monumental change. in 35 years. That would just be incredible. And if you throw us into the city in 1900, it's our world. It's our world today. There's some technological differences, and they pay it less, but things like that. Other than that, we would go there and it would make sense. We could function the way that people that know about wages and earnings. I say, hey, get a job and get a wage. You know exactly what I mean, all of you. If you would have said that in 1800, that would have been, they would have had so many different ideas about it that would have made no sense to us. It's a different world. Because that is kind of amazing. We have the Constitution and Declaration of Independence well before the Industrial Revolution changed everything. It's kind of interesting when you really think about it. But we have to get to the fact, because this is a big deal. Not only is it important for you to know, but it makes a great essay question. Did you catch my little hint here? So, the factors. Number one, it began in Britain. And it was in textiles. It's not that the British were smarter or more clever or harder working, even though that's what British citizens would think. But there's a whole series of things happened just at the right time and perfect moment for Britain. 1850s, 1860s, it just all happened. But they had begun the Industrial Revolution there. And I took this picture because not only because it's one of my favorite artists, Claude Monet, but he's showing this actually 1880s, but it's kind of London. It's impressionist art into the haze of an industrial town. It's just a cool painting. By the way, what bridge is this?
London.
That's London Bridge. London Bridge is no longer there anymore. In fact, the new London Bridge is this ugly, relatively, for the 1960s modern bridge. Anybody know where London Bridge is today? Yeah.
Lake Havasu?
Yeah, Lake Havasu, Arizona. They removed it brick by brick, and somebody bought it. Somebody who clearly had way too much money and interesting priorities, and they put it, it's kind of on this weird lake, just a bridge, London Bridge. That bridge. It's really wild. Second greatest impressionist artist, right? You agree? Cezanne. With me, just nod. Cezanne, right? Yep. I like Renoir. Okay, so, 2, the War of 1812. The War of 1812 will be crucial. Starting with that embargo, but then the British blockade, and the Embargo Act and British blockade, they couldn't get the British goods, textiles. This is the Royal Navy in Portsmouth. I thought it was a good picture to put up for the Navy. They couldn't get those goods. And that would encourage some Americans to think, well, if we can't buy it from the British, let's try to steal their ideas of something called a factory. So that would be the trigger. These two things. No, it did not happen overnight. The convulsions were really, I mean, they happened at different times, different places, different intensity. But the transportation revolution, which is intertwined with the Industrial Revolution, but I got to put it separately because it showed how radically different it was. I had a lot of different ideas for a picture, but the idea of the horse racing the American steam locomotive, I thought was a good picture. Low perspective issue, the horse is closer, looks bigger. This is an American steam engine, 10-wheeler. Those wheels, I would come to about here on that wheel. They are so big. By the end of the 19th century, those could go 100 miles an hour with those engines. That would be pretty cool to see a big steam engine barreling across at 100 miles per hour. Yeah, freight trains would go faster than today.
What year did this transportation?
So we're talking the first 50 years of the 19th century. So like 1800 to 1850. So it's happening, it starts then, and it coincides, in fact, it's intertwined with the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. And so this map, see the different colors? That is how fast it takes to ship goods. And we're talking relatively small goods, from New York City to various parts of the new United States. So this area in red, that's one full day of travel. That's how far they could get. So from New York City, they could get to here. Or to the end of Long Island. So it'd be 6 weeks what it's going to be Chicago. This is a little inaccurate. Cincinnati is here. It was actually faster to go all the way around, which would have been about 5 weeks to ship goods. But it gives you an idea how slow everything moved. I mean, you see this line right here? That's a week. New York City. So think how expensive and difficult it would be to move goods. Factories can't function unless you can get raw materials to one common location and then ship the manufactured goods out. Can't do it here, can you? In fact, to survive, virtually everything you need for survival has to be where? Within one day. That's all you got. That's pretty much it. The world moved at 3 miles an hour. 3 miles an hour, except for short bursts, obviously. So there are 3 elements of the transportation revolution. The first one, roads. We've already talked about the national road, and the federal government built this because these are still territories. That's why the bonus bill was different. But eventually, some federal government, some state government, some private turnpikes like the Chicago Turnpike, but you're going to get a number of roads. But most of them are going to be unpaved, pretty rickety, pretty expensive, hard to move goods. We'll talk more about how this happened, but there would be some roads. Private roads don't work very well. They got to charge tolls. The most famous would be from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And the first mile of it would be built outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. In fact, I know that because I took that picture. Right at 1790, they built that bridge and I was there. That's actually one of the first granite bridges that's in the United States that still survives. Thank you, I've been waiting for this. You got to read this in crayons. And it's one of the first that survived. And it's driving down the turnpike. And it's kind of risky to leave a turnpike. Because when you leave a turnpike, you got to pay a toll to get back on. So it's kind of expensive, but I figured I better use that picture. But what they did is, for the first 50 years of the 19th century, about 10,000 miles of roads were built, but most of them weren't all that great of roads. Now, anybody ever heard the term ton mile before? That's the amount it takes to transport 1 ton of goods 1 mile. That's a ton mile. It's about 30 cents. It was 30 cents a ton mile approximately in 1800. It halved to 15 cents. So transportation costs did drop by 15 cents, but still, it's moving at 3 miles an hour, isn't it? That's a Conestoga wagon from the 1840s. This picture was taken after the Civil War, but the same kind of wagons. So still moving very slow. There will be some road built. By the way, private turnpikes don't work. And because they would only go to places where they're very few have money. Now, don't forget that. They don't work.
Did we talk about the tariff of 1860?
I'm going to mention that a little bit later. Because I'll bring that up again when they get to the tariff of abominations. Yeah, I know. Don't be afraid. After roads, another big one, the transportation revolution, would be canals. And there were always canals. But the Industrial Revolution would trigger massive canal building in Britain, then eventually Germany, France, but a series of canals. And this is what we got to get for the canals. Most of the money for the canals came from state money. State taxes would pay for it. And you also notice that most in the north. Very good thing. But canals are very hard to build, very difficult. And usually the goal is to connect waterways to another waterway. So like the Ohio and Lake Erie, you'll get to the Ohio River from Lake Erie, and that sort of thing. And for this one, the Pennsylvania Canal, they had to go by wagon and train over, then eventually train to supersede. The Chesapeake on Ohio, that still functions. Not for business, I mean, not for, it's now a walking, it's a hiking trail. And 3,700 miles, which is a lot of canals, but connecting rivers you could navigate. But look how low the price was per ton mile. Water transportation is always cheaper because you put more stuff on a boat. 1 cent a ton mile. So transportation would actually, these costs would go down by almost 2/3. The most famous of these would be the Erie Canal. Mostly state money. This canal would connect the Hudson all the way to Lake Erie, and then subsidiary canals. And it's about 15 feet wide. The Erie Canal is a pretty amazing thing. Here's a painting of it. It would take 8 years to build. Tough labor, mostly immigrants would do that. And on both sides of the canal would be flat areas so they could pull them with oxen or mules. They would pull them. That's why that C&O canal is such a great walking drive. I walked about 5 miles on the C&O in the Appalachians, and it has to be flat. So it's a really nice, gentle, easy walk, easy hike. But they would pull these keel boats, eventually they would be steam powered, but this would be used well into the 20th century. And this would connect New York City to Chicago by water. Revolutionary. I always like this painting for lots of reasons. I think you can see it. You can see the horse, see the mules pulling it, the keel boats, and then look at these. Look at that pig. Look at that thing. And look at those joints, and what the heck happened there? That's a 40 to 50 ton pig. They made pigs industrial strength back then. And so by one last thing for today, steamboats. There were a couple of attempts at steamboats in Britain, but the first successful one, AKA the steam engine didn't blow up, was Robert Fulton, who wrote, I want to say Robert Claremont. Robert Fulton, who, what did I say about pictures? Yeah, I know, she looks 12. But the Claremont would be the first successful steam engine. Steam-powered ship. And once you have this, you go upstream, it would change transportation. You get heavier ships that could haul significantly more. You see a lot of these steam engines back then, they still have masts with sails to give it a little extra oomph. They would blow up all the time, really dangerous things. But this would be a revolution. They call it Fulton's Folly because no one thought you could make money off this, and it wasn't 100% successful. But once he built this, like all the rest of the Industrial Revolution, everything's built on the shoulders of others. There's one innovation that triggers 3 more innovations, which triggers 3 more. That's why today people think there's all this change. Yeah, there's a lot of change, but it's because of all the previous innovation. As Newton said, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. For the what? The Industrial Revolution, this first one I'll get to a little more detail when I actually get to manufacturing, but about 1850, 1860. And then there'll be a second Industrial Revolution that will start about 1880.
So it's like a 20 year now.
Yeah. Well, they started, a bunch of new innovations came about, and then also those just triggered all this stuff. And electricity. I can't even begin to tell you all the innovations. Yeah. Let's say it again. Crook bargain, and I'll talk about that a little more in class. So don't, but it's in the video. What that was is that it went to the House of Representatives. The election was 24, and every place was supported John Quincy Adams. And then Adams made the secretaries.
Oh, I remember like.
And Jackson supported said that's a corrupt mark.
Oh my God.
Sharp! Good! There you go. Now the haircut.
Where?
Let's go, Sharp! You do it, Sharp? No, this finger. Do you want to graduate? Not this. No, this. Not this. Not this. That.
That's kind of hard.
We got a lot of work to do.
My finger. Wow, fifth period really gets stuff done.
You have no idea.
Oh, it's cold.
Ready?
No, it's warm. I can't do
A
it.
lot of work to do. Because if you're the plumber, you
I like
gotta
your outfit here. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm coming in. I'm really intentional. Do it.
We do their ones.
I think so.
Let me see what you did. You only did 3. Yeah, we gotta do one more. I'll let you do it. Do it tomorrow. Okay?
Can I come in at lunch?
Yeah, just come in. Take your time. Everyone get in here.
Where's Missy Paul from Yes. Oh my God, so much time. I got so much time.
Yeah, I don't want to turn it off.
Well, we have all right, everybody. A couple things then. The first thing is first. I love that picture.
I hope so. What's that? Put it right over Paul's face.
No!
The disrespect I'm feeling from you right now. You like my spooky confusion? And I feel like the whole house. I was like, spooky.
What do I? Oh, it's my picture of money.
Are you ever going to talk about Lindsay today?
When's today's last day?